Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I am a little nervous right now, so I'm going to read off what I want to write or say. I just want to thank you all for coming and being here tonight. And I see a lot of names from our last call with Dean Spade about abolition. And I'm so excited to see you all here to talk with about defund the police. I just want to start off saying my name is Shimona Moreno. I use she, her pronouns, and I work for 350 Seattle as the Art and Movement Building Director. I'm calling in from the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people and of the Duwamish Tribe. We begin our meetings and our gatherings with an acknowledgement of whose land we're on to honor the original people who were here before us and to acknowledge the systems of oppression that have oppressed Indigenous peoples. I also specifically name the Duwamish Tribe because to this day, they are still fighting to be federally recognized. And because of that, they don't get a lot of the resources that federally recognized tribes get. And I encourage all of you to, oh, sorry, I got distracted. Can everybody hear me? Okay, good. Someone's audio isn't working. And I encourage all of you to check out this link here, Real Rent Duwamish, to help. Sorry. To learn more about how we can support the Duwamish tribe in their fight to be federally recognized. And I would also like to invite everyone to share where their names and their pronouns. And where and whose land that you're on. And if you don't know, here is a handy link for you to find out the land that you are occupying. And I'd also like to lift up in this acknowledgement our frontline workers, our health workers, the unhoused, and the folks who are incarcerated right now. It's now more than ever that we need to be looking to Indigenous wisdom to better care for our communities. And we are here on this call to learn. So I would like to invite everyone to kind of take a deep breath in as much as you can with these smoky skies and the heavy hearts that we have because of our political climates and the COVID. And then on the exhale, I would like you all to just kind of release the day, release the stresses that we came here with, and kind of set ourselves up to try and be present and to learn. So we'd like to invite everyone to take 3 breaths with me. So and feel free to close your eyes and get your feet firmly on the ground and just inhale. And exhale. Take one more inhale. And exhale. Take one more. Inhale. And exhale. Gonna be real for a second, the breaths were a little challenging. I have asthma, and so I've been trapped inside for a few days now because of the smoke, and I just want to honor how everybody's showing up, and I appreciate you coming to this space. And I just want to say how excited I am to see so many people here, and how honored I am to have Nikita Oliver and Jarrell, and Olaf here to speak to us about defunding the police. And I will throw it their way after I go through a few logistics here. I'm sorry, I forgot I had to do that. I just want to remind everyone that we are recording this call, and that we are going to make the recording available for everybody afterwards. If you do not want your face on the video, please turn off your video. We also have closed captioning tonight. If you look and wave your cursor at the bottom of the screen, you'll see an icon that says CC, closed caption. If you click on that, you'll be able to select show subtitles, and then you'll be able to see the subtitles. I will say there is a bit of a delay, and it's operating at about 80% accuracy. And if you have any troubles, definitely please let us know if you need us to speak slower or to speak up. We're striving to make sure that this will be accessible for everybody on the call and accessible for everybody who watches the recording later. Also, I would love it if everyone can please stay on mute while our speakers are speaking. And if you have any tech snafus, feel free to private message me or Ale. She's waving there. And also just like have fun, take notes, and we will follow up with the recording and resources by Monday. So with that, I would love to pass it on to Jarrell and Nikita and Olaf.
Hi, friends.
Hey, thank you so much, Shimona, for having us. We'll do introductions and then we'll get into a short presentation that'll last about 15-20 minutes. And then we really want to leave a lot of time for people to ask questions. Really honored to share space with y'all. My name is Nikita Oliver. I use they, them pronouns. I live in the coastal Salish territories, specifically on Duwamish land. And I want to second the encouragement to pay real rent to the Duwamish. The link is in the chat. And land acknowledgements are a good step in the right direction, but they're not action. So really encourage folks to actually do something active to partner with and be in solidarity with the Native peoples whose land you live on, because Native people are still here. Do not let whitewashed history erase the reality that Native peoples are here. And they're teaching us how to live in right relationship with the land, and leading really key, important movements for climate justice. So I pass it to Jarrell.
Thank you, Nikita. Peace, y'all. My name is Jarrell. I also go by Rel Be Free. I'm a musician and somebody that just organizes and lives here in occupied Duwamish territory. I'm from the south end of Seattle, though, which may be different than your end of Seattle. I got a lot of love, and I'm always kind of representing and speaking life of my neighborhood, because I really appreciate the historical connection to the greater Seattle area, of the particular area I'm from, and organizing. Peace to all the young folk, young Black kids who I do this organizing for, as well as all the queer and trans Black women that have raised me up to be where I'm at today. I appreciate being in this space to talk about defunding the police, and not just that, but how it connects to investing in communities, and how that connects to this greater thing that's come to be known as the prison industrial complex, which has very ever-reaching arms, and it's probably in the living room that you're sitting in. And we'll break that down a little bit as well. And so with that said, I'll pass it to the bruh Olaf.
Hi, everybody. My name is Olaf, he, him. I am currently on Duwamish territory, particularly on First Hill. Yesterday, Terrace is now a super gentrified community. It's not what it once was before, as a lot of places that we stand on and live on. I come into this space with much appreciation and gratitude for those that came before me, all the elders, all the organizers, and folks that have been doing this work before us, before maybe a lot of us in this room. And I want to also honor and give presence to our incarcerated family members that can't be here with us. And in particularly, I'll be speaking upon the freedom all aspect of defunding the police and our current movement that we are in now in Seattle and nationally. So thank you everybody from all around the world that invited us into the space and allow us to be in the space with y'all.
Thanks, Olaf. So I am a organizer with Decriminalize Seattle and King County Equity Now. And just to give a little bit of background, both are coalitions of organizations and individuals who have signed on to the movement demands. Decriminalize Seattle was birthed out of two very key movements, but many movements that came before these. The No New Youth Jail movement and the Block the Bunker campaign, both abolitionist-focused movements which believe in a world beyond prisons and a world beyond police. And those two campaigns, along with a number of other movements, have grown into Decriminalize Seattle, which has been on the forefront of the Defund movement, and is a coalition that represents lots of organizations, interracial, multi-generational, intersectional abolitionist body. And King County Equity Now is a coalition of Black-led organizations that is focusing very specifically on equity in the King County area, calling King County to account for the continued Jim Crow apartheid that is happening in this region, and to pay the fee, to acknowledge that Black community has never received reparations, reparations meaning to repair the rations, or to repair harm, to repair what has been stolen, and to ensure that Black community has the opportunity to heal and to thrive and to be self-determined and self-empowered about what our future is. So the three demands of the defund movement are defund the Seattle Police Department by 50%, invest in Black community, and to free them all. And I'm going to talk about the defund piece. So defunding the police by 50% basically means to divest dollars from that institution. In Seattle, we spend $410 million a year on a failed public safety system that does not prevent harm. And it certainly does not really stop or intervene harm. Oftentimes, police are called after harm has already occurred. And in many instances, police are called into situations where they likely escalate the situation. By escalate, I mean, maybe they're called for someone who's in a mental health crisis. Charlena Lyles was a mother who called in the middle of a need. She called police for help. She was known to Seattle Police Department as needing mental health supports. And at the end of that encounter, she was murdered. Her child she was carrying was murdered, and her 3 children were incredibly traumatized, and now have a lifetime of harm to sort through and loss. There are many instances in our city when Seattle Police Department is called to respond to a mental health crisis. Someone who lacks access to housing or other resources may be called to respond to someone who's in need of other types of supports. And Seattle Police Department is just not resourced or prepared to respond to those kind of crises. $410 million is a very bloated budget. And what we have found in the last 3 months is that many elected officials and many people working in Seattle city government don't even know how that money is spent. As a result of that, and in response to the movement, there was a budget inquest done by Council Member Teresa Mosqueda to investigate where those dollars are going. And honestly, to this day, we still do not have exact numbers on how the Seattle Police Department uses those dollars, that over-bloated and unaccountable budget. The Seattle Police Department budget has grown by about $205 million in the last 6 years. So 205 million times 6 years is $1.2 billion. It is an excessive amount of money spent on a public safety system that does not work for everyone. And in fact, much of what Seattle Police Department responds to now are folks in need of mental health supports, some property issues, or other calls like domestic violence that would be better solved by having restorative justice processes in place, which Seattle Police Department is not equipped to provide. So as we've been doing this work over the last 3 months, Seattle Police Department also spent $6.3 million policing protest. If we think about the relevance of those dollars, $6.3 million is actually 420 tiny homes. That's the equivalent. In a city where there are 10,000 relatives that do not have access to homes, we spent $6.3 million policing protests when we could have spent $6.3 million helping people come inside. And in light of the present COVID-19 global pandemic and the current ecological disaster we're facing with smoke and wildfires, we know that many of our relatives who are stuck outside or are not able to come in are really suffering. And so Defund is about asking questions like, what really creates public safety? What ensures that everyone has access to what they need to be safe and thriving? What sorts of supports within community-led movements can we be scaling up that already exist? And there are a number of investments that we can be making, and Jarrell will talk about that later. But what's really key for us to be latching onto is the opportunity right now in the midst of this moment to be making a major paradigm shift. The way that policing has been working in the United States, which many of us do know was built out of slave patrols, has been to protect property and to over-police communities that have lacked resources and opportunity to be able to take care of themselves. Oftentimes, police are used to criminalize poverty and to criminalize behavior that people are experiencing or taking part in for the purpose of survival. And with this moment in front of us, we're asking, what better ways could we be using our shared resources to ensure that everyone is housed, everyone has access to healthcare, everyone has access to clean water and good food, everyone has access to mental health care, and everyone has access to community-based supports. When we think about communities that are not over-policed, there are often communities where people have access to all of those resources. And so if we want to get to a place where everyone in our community has the opportunity to feel safe, to feel cared for, and to have an opportunity to thrive, we have to make a serious paradigm shift in the way that we think about public safety. And having armed police as our only response when harm does occur or when harm could occur sets us up to only be responding after people have already been hurt. And the current conversation around public safety, if we are able to make this transition, actually allows us to get in the position of preventing harm. We want to prevent people from being in the position where they'll ever interact with police or the criminal punishment system. And many of those things that I've talked about already, housing, healthcare, education, community supports, are the key to making sure that everyone has the opportunity to live lives without being terrorized by police. And so that's the defund aspect of it. The movement is asking for a 50% divestment from police. That is $205 million that can be going into a new model and a new paradigm for public safety. And I'll pass it to Jarrell to talk about the investment piece.
Thank you, Nikita. That was marvelous. You have such a way with words. I want y'all to think about this. I heard this this idiom, this saying recently. It's an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of the cure. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of the cure. 2 nights ago, I actually got into an argument with a police sergeant around midnight. And I was trying to explain to him the influence that poverty has on neighborhoods and people and communities. And this person was, and this particular individual was not convinced that eliminating poverty could eliminate crime and his idea of crime. And so I'm saying all that to say, as we mention the depth of the police budget, and I'm looking at what a resource from Seattle.gov, city budget of the proposed 2020 total city budget, and you got the police sitting at 410 million, while things like libraries are at 86 million. Housing is at 124 million. Civil rights is at 6 million. Immigrant and refugee affairs, 4 million. And Nikita just sent the Decriminalize Seattle website into the chat, and you can look at this diagram that I'm also looking at as well. And so the second demand of our 3-pronged and probably 4-pronged platform from this summer has been invest in communities, because it's not enough to just defund and take the money out of this police budget, but we're saying we actually want to be intentional about where we're saying the money needs to go, and Decriminalize Seattle, King County Equity Now. Like we said, we are coalitions, and so as organizing coalitions, we are made up of 20 dozens of different community organizations that do a lot of the direct work and service that we believe can be taken out of the police budget. One of the terms and things that we've been hearing a lot is we keep each other safe. And so when we talk about investing in communities, we're talking about scaling up organizations, businesses, peoples, and even just ideas that are operating outside of this institution of policing, because we got to face this reality that our brilliance has actually been the impetus for a lot of the best ideas that come out of the institution. However, they invest in the institutional idea and not in the community-based, self-determined version. And what we're saying is we want to increase the self-determination of neighborhoods, because as I mentioned, I'm reporting live from South Seattle. In my neighborhood, I'm watching the streets change. I'm watching schools change. I'm watching low-income housing be torn down and nicer housing be built up. But then the people that lived in them before are unable to live there. And so we're definitely living through a time where big business and where money is going is showing where people's value is. And in the city, it's shown time and time again that the value must be in responding to crime, responding to these issues. And that's what police will say, is that their job is to not prevent crime, but to respond to it. And I'm gonna start with that. I'm gonna end with that statement again. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of the cure. If we can invest in communities, if we can direct funds to be building up those youth-led organizations, building up those QTPOC-led, those organizations and groups of Black trans folks that have been doing organizing and supporting people in their community, but have not had the access to resource. $205 million, for being honest, it's not enough. There's still more of that fee that needs to be paid. We're talking about filling in gaps that have been completely ignored on purpose for generations. And so there's been part of the movement has been negotiating and convincing council members. Even right before this call, Nikita was on the phone with council members, not just trying to convince them, but also really trying to educate them. And that's something that we've had to play that role in. So there's been policy proposals on the table with city council, a plan for a research process to, identify the organizations that are doing some of this work, that we can redirect 911 calls, that we can implement transformative and restorative justice on a community level that is going to be more impactful in the long run. One, in teaching people how to care for each other and not relying on just, let me just call the police and then they'll deal with it, and then washing your hands of the situation. But how do we also think about the generations coming up under us, the young folk, that we can teach, we can create spaces for them to learn and create new ways of resolution with each other, and respecting our elders who have for years already been creating alternatives and better versions of these things that we just continue to rely on the police for. And so I just want to reiterate that the coalition model of DCRIM and King County Equity Now means that there's so many different organizations that we're tied to and connected to. And those are not the only organizations that should benefit from the reinvestment into community. And that's a part of what the research process would produce, is being able to identify the plethora of folks, not just in the city of Seattle, because this King County Equity Now is including all of our family members that have been displaced because of what's been going on in Seattle. And so we're talking Kent, White Center, Skyway, Burien, Renton, Tukwila, all the way out to Federal Way, and I'm sure much more. And so all these things are connected. When we say defund the police, we don't just mean cut their budget. We mean cut their budget, cut officers, and reinvest those dollars into community-based ideas so that communities can continue to build themselves up instead of be taken down when waves of gentrification and colonization hit them. And that's connected to the fact that we have a systematic attack on young brown and black people in this city to get them incarcerated, and it's why schools are not invested in. And so I'd like to pass the mic to Olaf to talk a little bit about why freeing the protesters is relevant to these demands as well.
Thank you, Jarrell. Thank you, Nikita, for leading me on to talk about Freedom All. And I want to say that when we talk about Freedom All, we talk about free the protesters. I want to bring in, again, as I said at the beginning, as a representative of the folks inside, of family members inside, of community members inside, whether it's API, CAG, that's a part of Decriminalize Seattle, or BPC, into this space. And I think when we talk about free the protesters, like, it doesn't matter if those protesters were protesting in regards to this movement now, or those individuals were protesting in regards to the oppressions that they was facing in the neighborhoods and their communities long before now. And I think for myself and a lot of members of my community and folks I know, like, we have always been in protests because of the system that was put in place, whether that protest turned into a burglary, a robbery, or selling drugs, or doing what is necessary to survive. I think and believe that those are forms of protest against the system. However, this system, the dominancy of this system, found a way to criminalize it, to incarcerate it. And a lot of our community members, a lot of our family members are now detained or locked up for a long time because of that protest that they was in then or in now. So I think to fast forward to this moment in time that we're in, when this movement first started, when George Floyd happened and everybody seen it online or on TV or on the internet, folks moved out on the streets. Folks moved about on the streets and moved on the streets. And I think, like, even politicians, elected policymakers supported those movements, supported those protests and encouraged it, right? Because it's everybody's First Amendment right to protest, to have freedom of speech and stuff. But when those protesters and protesters turned into a destruction of property or looting or otherwise, that violated their privileges and their entitlement. So that's when they started, I believe, started arresting folks and jailing folks. At current, we know of, there's been a lot of individuals arrested for protesting. There's been a lot of individuals released or bailed out from protesting. But at the same time, these same individuals, just because they have been released, there's some that are still detained or they're still jailed because of protests, because of further charges in relation to a protest. But I think when it comes to jailing protesters or jailing anybody, I think in regards to all three of our demands, that's probably the easiest thing to do, is free all the protesters, because it's just a matter of city leaders, whether it's Dan Satterberg or anybody at the King County Prosecutor's Office or the police in general, not arresting nobody, and the King County Prosecutor's Office not charging nobody. So a lot of folks that have been bailed out right now are still facing charges. And I think, you know, as I said at the beginning, they're still facing charges or they're still detained because it maintains that system, right? It reinforces that system that we're trying to get rid of, that we're trying to abolish and make disappear from our lives and our family members' lives. I think to further that too, like, we try to connect Freedom All and freedom protesters to the individuals that, again, as I said at the beginning, that already been incarcerated. And I think that as far as the way we look at it, when it comes to our community members, our folks that have been protesting, they see it as we're disposable, and that they can continue to reinforce this system by disposing of a lot of Black, brown, and indigenous bodies and folks that are on the furthest end of, I guess, entitlement of privileges. And we always want to include that into conversation, because most of all, without protesters, without the young folks, without the young folks being out there on the streets, council members, the mayor, SPD, Dow Constantine, Dan Satterberg, or whoever runs the city or runs the county wouldn't even be having this conversation, right? We wouldn't even be here now if it wasn't for the kids, the young people that were out there from day one, right? We're out there risking their lives, risking their bodies in day one. Like this, like, I think I want to touch on too, like what Nikita said previously, like this has been work that has been done for decades, right? In Seattle and otherwise, our elders, our ancestors that have been thinking about Black lives before George Floyd. However, the city leaders elected and everybody else didn't have a serious conversation about defunding until those kids were on the streets, until those kids was risking their lives. Those young people, those young women, those queer folks, the trans folks was out there risking their lives and their safety in regards to accountability, in regards to investing in community, in regards to defunding the police. So yeah, I want to give all shouts out to them and what they do and what they continue to do. There are still some that we know of now that are still locked up and doesn't have the means to be bailed out, doesn't have the means to be cared for like a lot of folks are cared for. There's still some out there that are at their home, that are in the hospital, that are still healing from wounds and scars by protesting, by being beat up by the police, by being shot by rubber bullets, by being breathing in tear gas and all that other stuff. So, I think we are only here talking about defunding the police, talking about reinvesting in communities because of the folks that were out there on the streets and because of the folks that continue to be out there on the streets. So we always want to uplift freeing the protesters. We always want to recognize and acknowledge our community members, our family members that have been in protests all their lives because the oppression of this system that we all have to be forced to live under. Yeah, that's all I really got to say in regards to freeing the protesters. Thank y'all so much. And I think we're open to questions and answers now.
Yeah, and I just want to bring it full circle. There are four major crises that we're facing right now. A racial justice uprising, a global health pandemic, an economic depression, and ecological disaster. And all of those things are interrelated, and they're all under racialized capitalism, a system that seeks to exploit and dehumanize both the planet and people. And so want to just express like our fights are very interconnected as we fight for climate justice and we fight for racial justice and economic justice. All of this is an interconnected struggle. And it's really important that we figure out how our movements align, because the same banks that are building pipelines and invested in tar sands are the exact same banks that are invested in the prison industrial complex, that are investing in lobbying institutions that criminalize poverty and allow corporations to exploit the planet. And so the more aligned we can be in our strategies, the better everyone will be. George Floyd was murdered over an alleged counterfeit $20 bill in the middle of a global pandemic where many people don't have access to resources. And racialized capitalism is very much to blame for why the system is allowed to perpetuate that kind of violence and racism upon people and never be held accountable for it. So if we can bring our movements together and understand how environmental justice and racial justice and economic justice are actually very much intersecting movements, we'll be much stronger and effective at bringing health to all of our communities in the way that we see it. And from my perspective, that is an abolitionist vision. Abolition is not just about dismantling police or prisons or courts. It is also about dismantling racialized capitalism. And even more, it is about envisioning a world beyond those things where we all get to live in healthy, safe, thriving ways. So we would love if there are questions to take those and try to engage them. I've put some links in the chat to Decriminalize Seattle's website, King County Equity Now's website. I provided some links about participatory budgeting, which Jarrell referenced, and also the blueprint to divestment. That was the initial document that was presented to the Seattle City Council. Shimona, do you want to do questions through the chat, or do you want to allow people to unmute and ask their questions?
Yeah, why don't we have people just throw your questions in the chat.
Jarrell, you want to jump in on what is one thing we can do to move this agenda forward?
A couple things. Can give money to the Duwamish, because our movement is wanted to be moving in stride and step with Indigenous folks, and specifically up here by just starting that first action item of supporting Indigenous folks in the land that you're in. Everybody can throw $20. Boom, at least. So I think starting there, and I think also just really asking yourself some of these questions. I think that there's a lot of cognitive dissonance that goes into being American and living very complicitly in this world. And so I think I would say ask yourself some of these questions. And Nikita just mentioned things like banks, places that we put our dollars in. Start questioning those. Asking yourself that. I want to keep it real. I'm not a professional. Tell white people what to do in this movement. I'm more I'm more tapped into wanting to move in stride with my folks. But what I'll say is definitely I think being educated is a great first step, because moving and action without education that can create harmfulness. That can create harm. And so I would say by being on these calls, and there's really like researching, follow up with all these things that are being sent to the chat. There's so much information. There should not be misinformation.
Oop, you muted yourself, Jarrell.
Pardon me. I was wrapping up, but I was really just saying, be informed, follow some of these links and get educated, because uneducated action creates space for harm to perpetuate. And then oftentimes we create harm unknowingly. And so I'd say for folks that would consider themselves disconnected from the communities that are leading this movement, I'd say don't think of it like that. Don't think of ourselves as disconnected, but think of ourselves as connected, but just question where those connections exist. And so I hope that there's some practical things as well as some more abstract things in regards to action items. And I'm sure there may be more, Olaf.
I just wanted to, I think I see Jonathan's question too, and it kind of relates to what you're answering. I think maybe Nikita could answer the other question, but I just want to, like, one thing I've heard recently is that the relationships we have with one another, a lot of folks before us, Indigenous folks that were on this land before us, that's how they built community, is being in relationship with each other. And a lot of times we think the police, we think the government's in relationship with us and will do what's best for us, but that's most of the time not the case. And I think if we could go back to the practice, when we think about a world of abolition, when you think of Native folks, they're in relationship with everything, right? There's nothing that's disposable. And whether it's the earth, whether it's the plant, whether it's the trees, whether it's the animals, or each other, they think of each other, of being in relationship with each other. So I think, in regards to that, I think those are the hard, like Jarrell said, those are the hard conversations we have to have with not just people in this room or people in our collective or people within our organization that are imagining abolition or abolitionists, is the people that sleep in the same bed with us or eat at the same dinner table with us, because those are the ones that have to be convinced, right? At the end of the day, those are the hard conversation we have to have. And I think a lot of times with folks that have been privileged or entitled by this system, that they think that the police keep them safe. the whole idea of defund SPD is shocking. It's like, oh, hell no. Like, what do you mean defund SPD? That's going to take away all my safety and security. But I think the reason why they have that response is because they failed to do the further analysis or the research of not just defunding SPD, but what does reinvestment look like, as Jarrell touched upon. Where does that money go, and how does that addresses the root causes of why we are where we are now? When you think about reinvesting in communities, reinvesting in taking that money and investing that in organizations within the community that could do this work, that could do things that SPD can't do.
Yeah. If you wouldn't mind if I can jump in.
Yeah,
I'm scrolling through the chat box, and I'm appreciating and, feeling just the robustness of the questions. And the reason why I use the word robust is because in these positions, organizers, myself, Nikita's, Olaf's, I'm sure Shimona's, and we have so many other comrades. We do this organizing work outside of our income generating work. However, we're so often expected to be able to do the job of the people that you probably actually vote for in regards to education. And so I'm appreciating the robustness of a lot of these questions around how do we how do we take out the militarization of the police? What does it look like to generate vision and inspiration of what our country can look like after abolition? What's happening with 2020 cuts? What can we do to push to override? What's the plan for the police officers? I mean, just imagine the realism of us being able to answer every one of those questions, and even all those questions being of our concern. When our point is made, we're here to advocate for the cutting of the budget, identify the community groups that need to be invested in, and getting people released that don't need to be incarcerated right now. There's definitely layers to this story. I think one of the things that I think can answer one of these questions is oftentimes people are asking us to lay out the entire process, the implementation process, the metrics of the implementation, and then also the desired results. I'll tell you what, we've been working really hard outside of our jobs to actually answer as many of these questions as we can. However, it has to be up. It's not just going to be up just one, because we can't. But then two, people haven't been asking these questions before people started saying defund the police. My question is, how are people asking us, how can people override a veto of a mayor when mayors veto shit all the time and no one ever questions it? I'm looking at the budget still, and it's never been. I go to council chambers. I don't hear people asking, how come the police budget is 5 times that of the homelessness budget, and we're apparently in a crisis when it comes to homelessness. And so there's one question I did want to just respond to in regards to the militarization of the police. I would say that's another piece of research that's really helpful. There's a group, and Nikita helped me with the name, but they have drawn the Deadly Exchange. Look up Deadly Exchange, because it actually talks about the connection between the Seattle Police Department and folks being trained in Israel, and the connection between that is speaking a lot to the militarization of the police. While we have folks with guns pulling up to potential medical situations. If you've ever called 911 before and cops show up and you wanted a medic, that's a function of the militarization of the police. And what we're saying is that doesn't always need to be the case. I want to pass the mic because I may be rambling.
I do want to talk about the override for those who do live in the Seattle-King County area. So next week is the override vote to overturn the veto of the mayor. And we need 7 of 9 council members to make that override happen. There are 3 packages that the Seattle City Council included in the rebalancing package for 2020. There was a $309 million shortfall due to COVID. And so they had to rebalance the budget. A part of that budget rebalancing included a 2% divest from the Seattle Police Department, which is about the equivalent of 100 officers. And then there were 3 investment packages. The first investment was $3 million to do participatory budgeting, and I included that link in the chat. Participatory budgeting is a democratic process of making sure that community members get to decide where funds go. It is a process that other cities use, and there's a national participatory budgeting organization that helps cities set this up in a way that it is led by communities, especially by those communities most affected by not having access to resources or government. There's a $10 million investment from the 2020 budget in scaling up community-based responses. So mental health, housing supports, domestic violence supports, supporting young people moving through situations. And that $10 million will go towards really increasing our ability to build the scaffolding and infrastructure over the next few years that we need in order to transition beyond policing. And then there is a $4 million investment targeted very specifically at violence interruption and prevention in the South End and the Central District. There's already a coalition of highly skilled violence interruption workers who are doing incredible work, but they're at capacity and they need an extreme investment in that work in order to continue doing it effectively. And then after we win this override, because y'all are going to convince those 7 of 9 council members to hold to what they said they were going to do in June, even though it's not even close to a 50% divestment, we have the 2021 budget that will be dropped, I think, September 24th by the mayor. And then we enter into a whole nother time of budget advocacy, encouraging council members to actually make good on their promise to defund by 50%. So there are some tangible ways to be advocating to our council members and pushing them towards this vision of a world beyond police. And for those of you who are asking questions about unions in the chat, I dropped a short primer in there about the role that unions like the Seattle Police Officers Guild play in preventing these really needed transformations. I know labor has been a relationship that climate justice advocates are trying to build. When we talk about the Green New Deal, transitioning our homes into being green, building green buildings is going to require having a strong relationship with labor because it is going to change some dynamics in the labor space. Similarly, our movement has been building relationships with labor because police have not always been allowed to unionize. And here in the King County, Seattle region, the King County Labor Council actually disaffiliated the Seattle Police Officers Guild, which was a very significant move in the right direction. And many, many workers had to organize to make that a reality. But there are many national affiliates that still allow police unions to be to be affiliated with them. So there's a lot of work to be done with unions as it relates to police. And then there was another question about why defund. I put a primer in there that's based on the work of Miriam Kaba, who is a very prolific abolitionist that has done lots of work on the issue of why defund police. And there is a short primer. It's 10 slides. It's on Instagram. So not a lot of information to digest, but it does give some really key information, key points about why we need to transition from policing into a better standard of care and safety for our communities. There's so many questions. Y'all ask great questions. Jarrell or Olaf, do you see questions you want to answer?
Yeah, something that just caught my eye. Let me scroll back up so I can catch it. It had to do with, oh, here we go. So divestment being at the start, divestment of the police being at the start, and how does the divest movement merge into larger economic equity issue? And I think what's important is for people to realize the role of organizers in the overall scope of how movements occur, because there is a capacity issue when it comes to how much we have the ability to move. And so a lot of what we do is both on the ground and small scale in regards to, we don't want it to be too external facing, because we have to be able to do it within our communities before we want something to be made massive. And so to just respond to the economic piece, I think that that's really important. And a part of what we're talking about is actually an economic, I mean, we talk about racialized capitalism. Capitalism is an economic system of oppression. It's not and the racialized element is specifically contextualized for the United States. But capitalism is an economic issue. And so one piece of the economic issue that we're addressing is redistribution. In every place that has an economy, there's income, there's outcome, there's GDP, and there's expenses. What we're saying is, where do we redirect some of those funds so that it can create investments in communities? And so specifically, I'm thinking about investment in education. That is an economic investment. Investing in young people's education is an economic investment. Investing in housing is an economic investment. And not just housing for like handouts, but education connected to how people maintain their housing, how people can build generational wealth. And so I think that the entire movement is economic. It's so many intersecting factors. So when we say something like defund the police, when Nikita mentioned abolition is also centered around eliminating the racial injustice, it's also addressing the economic element, right? Because masters and slaves, that's an economic contract. That almost has nothing to do with racialization. That has almost everything to do with status, class, and economics. And so I think by us educating on these things, and then also following up with a lot of these organizations that do invest in specifically economic work. And so I think about Africa Town Community Land Trust, who has been working really hard on procuring space for development. I know the Rainier Beach Action Coalition, who I work with as well. We've invested in educational classes for young adults between the ages of 18 and 24. And that's our attempt to be able to contribute to the economic education for our communities. And so personally, I'm always going to talk about education as the foundation of any action, because people can ask a lot of questions about what can we do, and then we tell you the answer, and then somebody has a follow-up question to the question, to the answer, and then we're in a dialogue and not doing anything. And so I start with just education. And I think that for myself, for Nikita, for Olaf, for everyone that I know that chooses to organize on the front, before we start organizing, we get educated. So we don't hop on these calls not having asked ourselves a million questions. Obviously, we can't ask ourselves some of the questions that some folks will also ask. But you can see also from just like the amount of times we have to go over information. So I would say educating yourself is the biggest thing before you start acting. And so I appreciate the question around economics. And I'm trying to follow up with all the questions, but there's a lot. These are great.
And I just want to highlight some more resources I dropped in the chat. So there's 3 that I think would be really helpful based on some of the questions that I see. The first is there's a Transgender Law Center that has put out demands and information that relates to what does trans liberation look like as it relates to abolition, and as we're doing this work in this movement for Black lives. There's a reparations toolkit that's been put out. When we talk about economic justice, we cannot ignore the exploitation of Black peoples, and we cannot ignore the stealing of land from Native peoples. And reparations is a major part of healing and setting those things right. But reparations can be a really challenging conversation to have. And so this toolkit is very helpful in guiding people in understanding, having a deeper understanding about the value of reparations. And then there's a chart, for those of you who like charts, that talks about the difference between reforming the police versus steps to abolition. Body cameras are a reform, more accountability systems, a reform, more training, a reform. And what reforms say is if we just provide more training and more cameras, we can try to work the racism out of the police department. And the truth of the matter is we cannot. Anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism is deeply rooted in the way that policing works here on Turtle Island. And we need to abolish this system that's not working and make our way towards a public safety system that works for all. So this chart works through the difference between reforms and actually transforming the way we do public safety. I'm all about resources. So for those of you who want to study, I got more.
And if you don't mind, I really want to follow up on that, because there's been a couple of questions in the chat specifically around like the suburbs, and I'm sure it's a question probably thinking about like, well, where do wealthy people fit in this, and the particular point around domestic violence existing across race and across wealth. And that's a very great point, and I appreciate that point. My mom was a domestic violence advocate for 15 years for the city of Seattle, and that statement is fact, that domestic violence is something that goes across and is intersectional. And so a part of what we're really wanting to invest in is community-based ideas. And so there are better ways to engage, one, to provide support for survivors of domestic violence and folks that have to overcome that, but then also for supports for the aggressors. Because being an abolitionist, we don't want to believe that throwing somebody in jail is the best way to rehabilitate them and get them to be a productive member of their community and their family and their society. And so I would say to those points, I appreciate that. And I would invite folks to be brainstorming and getting together with folks in their community to have those conversations around what does it look like to actually to address the harm that's happening in our areas, but then also how can we be the solution? You know, Grace Lee Boggs, to change the world, we change ourselves. And so a lot of the ideas that we're talking about as alternatives to police, whether we're talking about arts-based alternatives to probation, like creative justice, or autonomous community safety projects, like the Corner Greeters in Rainier Beach, and COVID-19 mutual aid as being a resource distributor throughout this time. All of these things were created directly out of community members and first started out with no budget. And so I think really brainstorming and thinking about what are the needs of your community when you zoom into an issue, because domestic violence resources are going to look different in North Seattle than they are in South Seattle in regards to how they're distributed, who's going to be accessing them, and how they need to be accessed. And I think that it would be best for community members to define what those terms are, but it does take us tapping into our imagination and our creativity, which goes to one of the questions of what does it look like for us to imagine and envision the world post abolition, post defunded police. And it really starts by wherever you're sitting, closing your eyes and imagining the world after. And if that's hard for you, then you probably need to do it every day with some crystals and some energy cleansers, because there's probably some kind of blockage that's occurring that doesn't allow us to even imagine these things, right? And so, yeah, shout out to crystals and all the healers.
Thank you so much. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Olaf. Sorry.
I put some links on there as well. I think so too. Like we have to do some investigation into or a deeper dive into restorative justice practices and transformative justice practices that a lot of organizations in community, whether it's API, Chaya, collective justice, do in regards to violence, harm, and healing. I think that's something that we all have to tap into and get into the practice too when we think about, you know, a lot of times when we think about safety, when we think about protection, the reason why a lot of folks default jumps to calling the police is because they don't have the education or the resources to do anything otherwise, right? And as we continue to say, when it comes to those incidents or when those things unfortunately happen, we can't always think that the police is Superman and is going to come rescue the day all the time. And I think going back to what I was saying previously, like if we are in actual relationship with one another, with our community, that's when we can begin to address those things and fix those issues amongst each other.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much. I just want to honor Olaf and Jarrell and Nikita for being here tonight and answering some of these like beautiful questions, y'all. Like, I am so glad to see how many people are just like really thinking about this and wanting to do more work. The work is on you now. There are going to be a ton of resources for you to sift through and to sit with and to act from. And I will make sure that all of the resources that Nikita and Olaf and Jarrell have put in the chat are in the follow-up email. And I will also make the chat transcript available in that email as well. I have some homework to do this weekend, so look for it on Monday. And I just want to kind of like close this out with like some gratitude and just like want to invite everybody to come off mute and just like clap and say your thank you and just be like, make some joy and noise for that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.